Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and in the Jewish world today, there are a number of people, a small number of people, who combine two qualities in a most wonderful and uplifting fashion. The ability to be keen observers of the Jewish scene with analysis that opens windows of understanding for us all, and at the same time, they have a loveliness to them that is unafflicted by any trace of pompous arrogance. They're just people who care deeply and passionately about other people, about the Jewish people, and about the state of Israel. And lucky, lucky us. That's the kind of rare individual we have the chance to sit with now and learn from on this edition of L'Chaim. It's an extraordinary pleasure for me to welcome Yossi Klein Halevi, who for decades now has been one of the most important and most well-respected voices on the Jewish scene today. If you're meeting Yossi Klein Halevi for the first time, let me tell you something about him and his impressive background. Yossi is an American Jew who made Aliyah with his wife Sarah in 1982, and he's been an Israeli journalist and author for more than 30 years, writing for the Jerusalem Report, the Jerusalem Post, op-ed pieces for the New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times. He's currently a fellow at the SHALOM HARTMAN Institute in Jerusalem and a contributing editor to the New Republic. And Yossi is also involved with a number of groups that are working very hard to find ways of bringing Israelis and Palestinians together. And Yossi Klein Halevi is a marvelous author. He's written many books, wonderful, moving books, reflecting his own personal journey from the far right to the Jewish community to a more left-leaning perspective. And Yossi has also written what many view as the single most important Jewish book of 2013, entitled Like Dreamers, the story of the Israeli paratroopers who reunited Jerusalem and divided a nation. And you know, every now and then a book comes along, like Yehuda Avner's 2010 bestseller, The Prime Ministers, and it becomes an instant classic, and a book people will look for years and years and years to find the insight into an important piece of Israeli history and Israeli life. That's what Yossi Klein Halevi has done with Like Dreamers, published by HarperCollins, which tells the story of 7 Israeli paratroopers from the elite 55th Brigade of the IDF, which was the Israeli unit most responsible for Israel's liberation of the old city of Jerusalem in the 1967 Six-Day War, and who then played a critical role in the Sinai during the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Yossi Klein Halevi interviews them all and weaves their individual stories into a tapestry that reveals the complexity of Israeli life today, the strengths and weaknesses of Israel today, and provides us, we the readers, who enjoy Like Dreamers, with an intimate look at a select group of Israelis who may well typify the larger Israeli community. And Yossi, what a joy and pleasure it is to have you sitting at this table. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Thank
it's
you
really
so much.
a delight to be with you.
Well,
and thank you for that.
You have done an extraordinary job. This took you a long time, Yossi.
Just 11 years.
11 years. It reads like you just sat one day down and just typed it out. It reads beautifully.
Thank you.
And people should know it's a story that, although it centers on these 7 paratroopers, it really tells the story of many, many, many Israelis, those related and friends. And there are 4 kibbutzniks and 3 members of the settler movement who play the critical role in your book. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about that and what this book is about. First, a little bit about you, okay?
Could I just correct one
Please, yes. No,
point?
any mistake I made, please.
That I did, in fact, grow up on the far right of the Jewish community. I was in the Beitar youth movement, and then as a teenager, I was with Mayor Kahana, but I wouldn't say that I went to the left. I consider myself very much in the center.
Okay, it's good. By the way, that's an important correction. You know, when people read about you and hear about you, and we understand some of the work you do, you have been very much involved in trying to find reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians.
Yes.
That is normally associated in today's Jewish world with the left, unfortunately. Yes?
Exactly, unfortunately, because I don't see that as a left-right
That's
issue.
a center position, isn't it?
That's right,
yes.
Absolutely.
But unfortunately, the way it's characterized in general in the American Jewish community is, oh, you must be a leftist.
So I would say that what distinguishes a left-wing approach generally to trying to reconcile with the Palestinians from a centrist position is that a centrist Israeli affirms our right to the whole land. It is Judea and Samaria is mine, but for the sake of peace, I'm ready to compromise. That's a very different position. I do not cede the principle of my claim to that land, and I also don't feel particularly apologetic. And much of the left comes to the table with the Palestinians from a place of excessive self-recrimination.
Mm-hmm. I am so glad you clarified it, because one of the things I did want you to talk about was, on the one hand, you have written and spoken about how you really believe the West Bank is Jewish, and yet at the same time you are willing to relinquish it. I've argued here on Shalom TV that the overwhelming majority of Israelis, no matter how they feel about the West Bank, are willing to make a territorial compromise because sharing the land makes a certain degree of pragmatic, and not only pragmatic sense, Yossi, but in some way, a way of solving a problem in a just and fair fashion, even if they believe that Judea, Samaria, the West Bank, with Hebron and the Cave of Machpelah, really belongs to the Jewish people. But do you agree with me that the overwhelming number of Israelis would really take your position?
Yeah, look, I think it's true from Prime Minister Netanyahu to probably about 70% of the Israeli public, and we've seen that coming through poll after poll over the last decade. But it's interesting because I think that what a centrist Israeli would say is that on the one hand we agree with the left that we need to try to find a two-state solution. On the other hand, we agree with the right that we don't trust the leadership of the other side to make a real peace because they don't accept our legitimacy in any borders. So in a way, most...
Does that reflect your position?
Oh, very much so, very much so. And in a way, I'd say that most Israelis, certainly centrist Israelis, think of a Palestinian state in two ways. One is that it's an existential necessity for Israel. It has the possibility of preserving Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, and it's also an existential threat to Israel. And I have two nightmares, Mark, about a Palestinian state, and I think this is really in some ways the heart of the centrist sensibility. The first nightmare is that there won't be a Palestinian state, and that the status quo will continue indefinitely. And the second nightmare is that there will be a Palestinian state. And right now, truthfully, the second nightmare is stronger than the first.
Why is there a nightmare that there won't be a Palestinian state?
Because look, the demographics are working against us. And to be in a situation where we would ever have to choose between Israel's two essential identities as a Jewish state and a democratic state would mean that it would not be the Israel that we know and love, and it would lose the allegiance of half the Jewish people.
Okay,
if we're not a Jewish state, we lose half of that alliance. If we're not a democratic state, we lose the other half.
All right, I want to push you a little bit and understand it better. The state of Israel right now has generally internationally recognized borders, and they don't include the West Bank. Israel is inside what's known as the Green Line. The fact that it's an armistice line, nobody knows about it, nobody understands the history of it.
Right.
But there are internationally recognized borders, and when everybody speaks about the borders of Israel, that's what they're referring to. There is no demographic threat inside the Green Line. Why do you say that there's a demographic threat to Israel?
Well, because emotionally, I do consider Judea and Samaria part of Israel. It's part
You have
of
the
our
right to
being.
that emotional feeling. It's not, however, an internationally agreed to reality.
Yes, but you see, if we were to annex the territories, we would then find ourselves with an acute
Absolutely.
demographic.
Why would we annex the territories? We haven't done that so far.
Right. So what are you saying, that we could just continue the status
Well, you know,
quo?
it's interesting. I hear some Israelis, and the one that I wanted you to comment on is Ruth Gavison, who's a professor at Hebrew University. And Ruth comes to America. She's part of a GA, General Assembly. And she says to the audience, Israelis want peace very badly. But it's wrong to say we have to have peace. We haven't had peace for this long. If we have to live without it, if they will not make peace with us, peace where you won't have that nightmare that there will be a Palestinian state.
Oh,
we
I
will
completely agree.
continue to will continue to live just as we have lived. And Yossi, I don't understand why that is not a legitimate Israeli position and Jewish position, if, as you describe, you feel that the Palestinian leadership is not at the moment ready to make the ultimate statement that Israel has a right to exist as an independent state.
Look, Mark, if my choice is maintaining the status quo or endangering, God forbid, the existence of Israel, obviously I continue with the status quo. We've continued until now. The question is, if there isn't a chance for peace, and there isn't anytime soon.
And you don't think there is?
No, no, definitely not. There is a possibility for an interim agreement, although even that is very slim. Then the question really is, what are we supposed to do in this prolonged period without peace? And I think that we need to impose certain restraints on ourselves. If we can't negotiate an agreement with the Palestinians, we should not be changing the facts on the ground. And the settlements should be, any settlement building that happens, if at all, should happen in those areas that are known as the settlement blocks that are close to Israel's borders. Personally, I would like to see a settlement freeze imposed unilaterally by Israel across the board in the same way that Netanyahu did a few years ago. He imposed a 9-month settlement freeze and got zero credit for it. You know, that's part of the problem. That was, I think, one of Obama's major mistakes, among many major mistakes in the Middle East. But at a time when we're facing a possible showdown with Iran, and when Israel may have to go it alone in launching a preemptive strike against Iran, a strike that I think is becoming more likely and more necessary every day as we see the American administration in retreat, then the question about settlement building becomes all the more urgent, because it is an unnecessary diversion. We don't, it will not enhance Israeli security in one iota to continue building in the settlements now. Whatever happens in the future, let's defer that. But we are facing a life and death situation.
I want to understand it again more. And you say it so well, so take it one more step for me. Supposing somebody says to you, look, first of all, are you talking about horizontal growth or vertical growth? Because there's been this notion that within existing settlements, there should be no reason why you can't add a bedroom on top of a building.
Yes, of course. But
so you're really talking about extending the borders of settlements.
Yeah, that's a distinction that some in the Likud made to the administration. And it's a useful distinction. Of course, people need to continue living. But as a national project, this is not the moment.
Okay.
Now, a poll was just taken of asking Israelis, where would you like to see the government cut its budget from? Over 80% said settlements. Now, that includes a lot of Likud voters. It includes a lot of voters for Avigdor Lieberman's party. It's a lot of right-wing voters. So this is, let's leave aside the argument over the settlements. This is not the moment.
And I want to say one more element of this. Would you argue that there is something intrinsically immoral about Jews building settlements on the West Bank? Or is it purely at the moment a pragmatic view?
No, it's for Jews to be living in Judea is not immoral. We are not colonialists. We are not occupiers in Judea and Samaria. We are occupying the Palestinian people. We are preventing them from reaching sovereignty, which is an inevitable result of their leadership refusing to make a real peace with us. I don't feel guilty about occupying the Palestinians. I don't think I have a choice. I don't want to occupy them. I don't see that. I didn't come home to deprive another people of their sense of home. But if you're giving me no choice, if you're telling me it's us or them, then it's us. That's clear. But if you're, in terms of the morality of this, look, I think that there were times, certainly in the first Intifada, I was drafted in the first Intifada. I served in the IDF in the Gaza refugee camps in those years, and I was deeply, deeply affected.
In what way?
Of seeing the meanness of an occupation, and you know, we weren't particularly brutal. We're not particularly brutal occupiers. As occupations go, I think on the whole, most Israelis are decent people, but no occupation is decent.
Were you mean?
No, but when you I'll give you an example
Please.
of the kinds of things that you routinely are called upon to do. You're patrolling along the Gaza beach. There's a sack in the middle there on the sand, and we call it in Hebrew a chefetz chashud, or what's the English term? A suspicious object. And so we called over one of the bathers, one of the Gazans, and said, move it, just move the bag. Now, that is what you need to do if you're going to enforce an occupation.
But that, in your mind, represents meanness?
It represents by meanness, I mean the smallness of the whole thing. It reduces us to as a society, to something that we don't want to be. I draw a distinction between checkpoints, which are necessary. Mm-hmm. Checkpoints save lives. We've had experiences of pregnant women, Palestinian women, concealing explosives under their blouses. We know what we're dealing with. We're not naive. But what I'm saying is that there are other elements of an occupation. For example, there's graffiti. Anti-Israel graffiti is painted on a wall near a house. 2 a.m, our unit would knock on a door, drag the father of the house out, tell him go get paint, and paint it over. Now,
that's a better example to me.
It's petty.
It's petty. Unnecessary also.
So, but this is built in. When one society is occupying another society, how do you enforce it? And that other society is in revolt. Now, look, I used to be a guilty Israeli. I used to feel guilty about this. In the 1990s, you know, after the first Intifada, what I just said to you about the occupation, that's pretty much where I would have ended it. But something happened in the year 2000. We offered a 2-state solution. We became the only country in history to offer voluntary shared sovereignty over its capital city. We did that. We did it at Camp David in July 2000. Then we accepted the Clinton proposals of December 2000. What we got in return were 4 years of the worst terrorism in Israel's history. The Israeli left collapsed. It is a shadow of itself today. There's virtually no Israeli left. We just had elections in Israel, just recently. There was only one party that placed the peace process at the center point, and it wasn't even the Labour Party. The Labour Party, the party of the Oslo process, ran on a policy of domestic issues. Tzipi Livni ran on a peace platform and got all of 6 seats. Most of us are not guilty Israelis anymore. We tried to make peace. The leadership on the other side proved that it's not ready to accept my legitimacy in any borders. Now, but that's the centrist position. The centrist position is, you can't neatly characterize it. It means that if I could end the occupation, I would. I'm desperate to end the occupation.
Aren't most Israelis?
But I can't.
But don't most Israelis feel exactly as you do?
Yes, exactly this way.
If you also tell me that as much as you want the occupation to end, as much as the Israeli people are ready to share the land, there is a leadership within the Palestinian community that won't, in essence, work with you.
Exactly.
Then if that's the case, what do you win by not building more settlements? It sounds to me like you've already predetermined an outcome here. What's the difference?
If you build in settlements, then you are predetermining the outcome.
But you're telling
changing.
You have no hope anyway.
I didn't say that. I said for now, there's no chance. For the foreseeable future, we are living in a totally transformed Middle East that is changing mostly for the worse. The changes are pathological, but there are also changes that are worth paying attention to that are potentially positive. There is a Sunni-Shiite civil war in the Middle East. That has opened the way for new, at least tactical alliances between Israel and parts of the Sunni world that could eventually become strategic. Israel and Saudi Arabia today are closer, and Iran, I'm going to say something terrible here, Mark, than Israel and the United States. Israel and the White House do not see Iran eye to eye anymore in the way we perhaps once did because of Rouhani negotiations. We read the map in the same way as the Saudis.
That's a very dramatic statement.
It's a very dramatic statement. It's a very troubling statement in one way. In another way, it opens up all kinds of possibilities for Israel in the region.
So may I say that what I hear you're arguing for is that while there may not be an intrinsic moral reason not to build settlements, you're hoping that as the Middle East changes in a larger sense, you want to give peace every chance.
I want to be
for
sure.
that you would say to the Jewish community of Israel, don't build don't extend the settlements further.
And I think most Israelis would agree.
I agree. By the way, I agree 100% with everything you've said, and I have argued over and over that I believe that where the Israeli public has wound up after a tortuous journey is very much...
Oh, exactly right.
At the same time, I think you express it and articulate it better than most, and I'm very, very pleased.
Well, thank you. Thank you. But, you know, I think it's important to emphasize the distinction that you were making earlier between the moral and the pragmatic. When settlements are attacked on moral grounds, it drives me crazy. Jews living in the land of Israel, and the settlers are absolutely right when they say, what's the difference between living in Hebron and living in Tel Aviv? Well, there is a difference. In Hebron, we have much deeper roots. And Hebron is the place where we resonate most deeply as a people. If we're going to have to make compromise, if there's going to be a two-state solution, it will be an historic tragedy for the Jewish people. And probably the Palestinians feel the same way because they're going to have to give up their claim to what they see as theirs as well.
Okay. And I have to say to you, it's the only place so far I really disagree with you.
Which is?
It won't be a tragedy.
For us?
Israel, yes, and I'll tell you why I say that. Redemption takes a long time. And it may be, nobody knows God's timetable. And it may well be that there will be a time in the distant future when all of Eretz Yisrael, for all I know, the entire Solomonic kingdom will be the modern state of Israel. But at the moment, if there is a viable, safe and secure Jewish state of Israel,
Mark,
that will not be a tragedy
Mark,
for
I
me.
agree with you, but taking Jews physically out of their homes in the land of Israel is
sad. It's very sad.
Oh, it's for me. It's a nightmare. It's a trauma. I end this book in 2004.
Yes, you do.
And one of the reasons is that I couldn't bear writing about the withdrawal from Gush Katif, the Jewish settlements in Gaza. I couldn't. I had one withdrawal in the book, which was from Yamit and Sinai, And I figured it's enough. I don't want to go through it again. And immediately after the withdrawal from Gush Katif, which I supported, okay, let me emphasize that. Politically, I supported.
Yes.
Emotionally, I was sickened. I went with my son, who at that time was 16. I said, let's just get on a plane and go. We went to Turkey.
You did. You literally left the country. It was so troubling to you.
Yeah.
Yes. We should make sure our viewers remember when Begin and Sadat made the peace agreement between Israel and Egypt, it was predicated on Sadat and Egypt with getting all of the Sinai back, including this settlement, this gorgeous settlement on the coast,
Yes.
over the quote Green Line in Sinai.
Which the Labour Party built, by the way.
Yes, but Begin was planning on retiring there.
That's right.
And Begin said, tear it down.
That's right.
And Arik Sharon came in there and he put settlers on trucks and took them out and they dismantled the town.
Mark, the only political leaders in the history of the State of Israel who have dismantled settlements are from the Likud. Mm-hmm. That should tell us something. Mm-hmm. I think it tells us two things. One is that under certain circumstances, the mainstream of the Israeli public, left to moderate right, accepts withdrawal, and also that a majority of Israelis want the right to be in charge of a peace process because we don't trust the left.
Interesting. By the way, could it all be a comfort to you if I say to you, if you ever get to the point where there is a Palestinian leadership that really will make peace, maybe they'll permit the settlers to remain, even if it's under Palestinian sovereignty, in those settlements, which for us will always be Eretz Yisrael, so they'll be living under a Palestinian flag. But I don't want to assume that if there is a real peace, you'll have to be traumatized in that way.
Yeah, and that is in fact Netanyahu's position. Netanyahu has said several times that under an agreement, Jewish communities will have to be left behind. Now, pay attention to that language. He didn't say Jewish communities will have to be uprooted. So I know that that is what he's aiming for, whether it's possible or not.
I've had people sitting around this table, left and right, arguing, debating the reality of the peace process right now. I am constantly hearing those on the left say they don't believe Netanyahu. They believe he is just mouthing words but really doesn't mean it. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, they believe Abbas and everything he says.
That's right.
I don't care about Abbas right now. I want to know from your own perspective, how much do you trust that what Netanyahu is saying about a two-state solution, which was at one time something he would never say?
Well, that's my answer to you, Mark. That's exactly my answer, is that, look, I personally think he means it. I think that when the leader of the Likud stands up and says that I am in effect reversing 70 years of my party's ideology, I think that that's an historic concession right there. But the truth is, it doesn't matter if he means it or not, because it indicates just how drastically Israeli political discourse has been transformed. 15 or 20 years ago, people forget this, the Labour Party, during the Oslo years, opposed a Palestinian state. The last speech that Yitzhak Rabin made to the Knesset before his assassination 18 years ago, no Palestinian state, no redivision of Jerusalem. Now, Labour Party said no 15, 20 years ago. Today, we've had two Likud prime ministers saying yes to a Palestinian state under the right conditions. Mm-hmm. Now, what I want of my prime minister is someone who will say yes, but. I want a willingness to explore the possibilities of peace, but without the illusions of the 1990s.
In this context, it's interesting. I had no intention of starting here, but we're going to finish here. I wanted to ask you something about your personal life. Maybe we'll get to it. I want you to take two of the characters, human beings. These are not fictitious. These are not fictitious characters. In Light Dreamers, you talk about real people who just, if you had said to me before I read your book, how many of those who were in the Six-Day War and who liberated Jerusalem were also in the 73 war, I would have said it's a different generation, which is silly. It was only 6 years later. Mm-hmm. But you write about and I want Arik Achmano.
Achmon.
Yes, Achmon, I'm sorry. And Yoel Ben Nun. Okay.
They are my two favorite characters.
Are they really? Okay, okay. So one of them, Arik, goes on and helps build Israel's aviation industry, correct? As opposed to a guy like Uri Adiv, who you talk about, who actually sort of aligns himself with the Palestinian cause, correct?
Yes.
Spends years, 12 years in Israeli prison. At the same time, you've got Yoel Ben Nun from the religious Zionist movement, who ultimately breaks with the settlers after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in 1995. One question for you. As you look at the sweep of history and the characters you have, the human beings you got to know, many people keep saying, oh, if Yitzhak Rabin had only lived, the entire process would have gone in a different direction.
Shtuyot. Nonsense, as we say in Hebrew. It had nothing to do with Rabin. It had nothing to do with the assassination. It had everything to do with Arafat. And not only Arafat. People forget Abbas supported Arafat's rejection of Camp David and his rejection of the Clinton proposals. Ehud Barak put an offer on the table that Rabin would have never made. Rabin was the general who presided over the reunification of Jerusalem in the Six-Day War. He would not have redivided Jerusalem. People forget this. So Barak redivides Jerusalem. He offers to redivide Jerusalem. And what is Arafat's counteroffer? Exploding buses in the streets of Israel. It's such a fantasy, and it's on that long list of things that drive me crazy. And really, when the diehard left talk about oh, if only Rabin had lived, and Yasser Arafat, Yasser Arafat is the master of linguistic deception, peace in English and holy war in Arabic. I mean, what do they think was happening all those years? So I'm sorry, I get emotional about this.
Why does Uri Adiv align himself with Palestinians? And what do you feel Uri Adiv symbolizes about the current Israeli people?
It's a very interesting question, because some of my friends who I write about in the book, Arik Achmon, for example, some others, didn't want me to include Uri Adiv in the book because he went so far left that he became anti-Zionist. And Uri Adiv is an Israeli tragedy. The reason, there are several reasons why I wanted to include him. One is because this book tells a generational story. And the range of characters in the book are from far right. We have Yehuda Etzion, who tried to blow up the Dome of the Rock in order to build the temple, all the way to Uri Adiv, who tried to create an anti-Zionist terrorist group between Jews and Palestinians, and points in between.
Is each of them so far on the extreme, it is inappropriate to say they represent any part of mainstream Israeli society?
No, those two that I just cited do not represent the mainstream.
They do not?
Not at all.
Why did you want to make sure you wrote about?
Because they represent part of the response of this generation to the Six-Day War.
But it's a teeny response.
It is, and they are not major characters. I mean,
okay.
But here's the thing about Udi, to answer your question. Uri Adiv does represent a significant, if very small, part of the Israeli public today, and that is that part of the left-wing elite. You can find them writing for the Haaretz editorial page in particular, who have fallen out of love with the Zionist story. And they are a very small minority, insignificant in Israel, but amplified abroad. These people have a tremendous presence, especially in Europe, Western Europe, and a growing presence on American campuses, for example. You'll find them in the New York Review of Books, sometimes on the op-ed page of the New York Times. That minuscule slice of Israeli intellectual life that has gone so far left that they're anti-Zionist is represented by Uri Adiv.
And they are given voice as if they represent a much larger slice of Israeli society.
Exactly, and that's part of the problem. When they're translated abroad, taken out of Israeli society, I can't tell you how many mainstream Jewish communities I go to, lecturing now on this book, and I go to synagogues and liberal synagogues where organizations like Shovrim Shtika, a tiny group of reservist soldiers who have turned very, very far left, are seen as normative figures. And so there is a very strong impact, unfortunately, from my point of view, a very strong impact that this anti-Zionist group of intellectuals have had on Israeli political discourse.
It's a very important insight. Yoel Ben Nun, he leaves the settler movement after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. What is that in its larger context?
Well, he doesn't leave the settlements. I mean, he moves from one settlement to another, and the settlement that he leaves and the settlement that he joins is geographically significant. He was one of the founders of Ofra, which is near Ramallah, and he had moved back to Alon Shvut, which is in Gush Etzion in the Etzion block. He was actually the founder of Alon Shvut, and then moved to Ofra. The significance there, I think, is that, and it's symbolic, but he's moved from a settlement which is outside the national consensus, and that's Ofra, to a settlement which is within the national consensus, part of the settlement blocks. And that represents Yoel Ben Nun's conclusion that if faced with the unbearable choice between preserving the wholeness of the land of Israel or the wholeness of the people of Israel, he will opt for the wholeness of the people. Mm-hmm. And that really is his personal and also theological journey. Yoel Ben Nun, Rabbi Yoel Ben Nun, was one of the leading theologians of the settlement movement for many years. It's one of its most creative and interesting theologians. And to this day, he's, I think, one of the most important voices in Israel, mm-hmm. not as appreciated as he should be. And one of the joys that I have in releasing this book is bringing someone like Rabbi Yoel Ben Nun to the attention of the Jewish public.
That's wonderful, Yossi. And by the way, it would seem to me, I would hope most Jews would make the same choice he did. Would you?
In terms of?
If I have to protect one or the other, I'm protecting the Israeli people.
Of course.
And you know, the state of Israel and the notion of return to Eretz Yisrael in our homeland is a fabulous conceptual drive in the Jewish people. But very often American Jews forget Israel is not an object. Israel is a community of family here. These are human beings, men, women, children, who are doing the best they can, and they're only human beings. Mm-hmm. And we sometimes have so little patience in America for people outside of America. We have exquisite, eternal patience with the chaos that we're living in here. But very often we forget their people, and so I give that perspective enormous credence.
I appreciate that.
There was a New York Times review of your book in which a reference is made to the capture of Jerusalem. Is that how you would characterize what happened to Jerusalem? By the way, again, for the viewers who have not yet seen this book, and Like Dreamers is something you want to have in your library. You live with this book, and it's a book you can read over a long period of time. And when you start reading it, it's hard to end before you get to the end of a story. And it's story after story after story, person after person after person. HarperCollins published it. But did we capture Jerusalem? Is that your verb?
That was the New York Times verb.
I know. I want to know if it reflects...
No. No, we liberated Jerusalem.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. And should Jerusalem be a united city, or is Yossi Klein Halevi willing to say, for the sake of an honest peace, in which no parent has to worry again about a child or grandchild. There will be an honest peace. Would you be willing to give up East Jerusalem?
Yes, I would have to just expand on what we mean by an honest peace. An honest peace would be one in which Israel's legitimacy is unequivocally accepted.
You want that?
East. That's a precondition.
As a Jewish state?
That's a precondition. Precondition.
Mm-hmm.
If we had that, I would be willing to amputate a part of myself, which is what it is. Yes, yes, definitely. And I think a majority of Israelis would.
A vast majority.
But do I think that that's going to happen in this generation? I don't.
I understand. I want to ask you one more question about the way the book is subtitled. Like Dreamers, the story of the Israeli paratroopers who reunited Jerusalem and divided a nation. I say this gently and with all respect. What do you mean they divided a nation?
This book is a history. If I were writing about Israel today, I would not characterize Israel as a divided nation today. We were, from the late 60s, especially after the Yom Kippur War of 1973, until I would say the second Intifada of 2000, we were a deeply divided nation.
Between left and right.
We were blue state, red state, and one state. Very, very deeply, very deeply. And look, it resulted in the assassination of a prime minister. We were in a kind of a civil war. And this book tells that story.
And the war was over what? Just make sure our audience understands.
The war was over peace, land, identity, history. It was over our being. This is why it was so bitter. And it was an existential argument. The left argued that if we don't withdraw, we will be in an existential danger. And the right argued, if we do withdraw, we'll be in an existential danger. That's what has made our debate so bitter, is that both sides saw this. If the other camp wins, Israel is existentially threatened. It's not like a political debate in any other country. In other countries, if one side or another loses, then okay, the country will be diminished, we'll have more problems. You don't worry that the life of the existence of the country will be threatened. That's why this debate was so bitter. Most Israelis today have resolved the debate. If we can create a two-state solution, we'll do it. If we can't, we're not going to beat our breasts in self-recrimination. And we'll get on with our lives. And that is Israeli society today. And so the book, where the book ends, the last chapter, and I hope I'm not giving anything away, but the last chapter is called Careening to the Center. Mm-hmm. Because that's how we do. In Israel, we don't naturally evolve. We veer. And Israeli society, as a result of the Second Intifada, is now very much, as a whole, in the center. Look, of course, we still have our far left, and we have the hard right. Most Israelis are not there anymore. Mm-hmm. Most Israelis are pragmatists. Whatever works. If you tell me this, we can maintain the status quo, then okay, then that's what we'll do. If you'll tell me that there's really a chance now for the kind of peace that you just described, then I'm willing to explore it. That's where we are.
Mm-hmm. I want to make sure you say this one more time. When you talk about Israel as a divided people, as a traumatized people, as a besieged people, is it less so today than it was in the year 2000?
No. Well, we are much less divided than we were in the past. I think we're deeply traumatized people. I think as a society, we are in post and pre-traumatic
I want you to talk
stress.
About what's the trauma? Where does it come from, and how does it manifest now?
I think there are a couple of levels to the trauma. The first is simply that what has happened since the year 2000, and I don't think that American Jews have sufficiently understood this, is that the home front, the Israeli home front, has become the main battleground. That hasn't happened since 1948, when we were fighting literally house to house. in all our wars between 1948 and 2000, the front was at a remove, not a vast remove because of the intimacy of geography, but there really was this sense of the home front was being protected by the army. Since the year 2000, the enemies of Israel are not targeting the Israeli army. They are sending missiles into Sderot, blowing up buses in Jerusalem, Hezbollah sending rockets into the Galil, into the north. That has been the war. And so we have had a shifting war from the 4 years of suicide bombings of the Second Intifada to the war with Hezbollah in 2006 to the Hamas rockets from over the years till 2009. And we are now the combatants. Civilian Israel is now the battlefront. That is a major psychological shift in Israeli reality. And that has contributed enormously to the sense of deep personal insecurity among Israelis. And the Second Intifada, there were a disproportionate number of high school students who were killed, so that the age level of when Israelis encounter life and death began to drop. We are a society that knows that the home front is in the greatest danger if we launch a unilateral strike against Iranian nuclear facilities. Iran will not retaliate against Israeli army bases. They'll retaliate against Tel Aviv. So the personal security, sense of security of Israeli citizens has been deeply undermined. So that's one level. Conceptually...
Hold on. Stay there with me for a minute. You know, I give you this example only because it really reinforces what you're saying. Daniel Gordis comes to America and gives a speech where he talks about that when Israeli parents put their child to sleep at night, they understand that there is always, whether it's today or tomorrow or the next day, an existential threat that Iran, if it ever got a nuclear weapon, would one day decide to drop a nuclear bomb on some Israeli city. And the parents have a real nightmare themselves when they worry about their children. Their children don't understand it, Gordis says. The adults do. How does the Israeli, especially the Israeli parent, you know, when we look at Israeli life, it seems to be going on. You visit Israel, it's amazing. The vitality, the vibrancy.
We have a great capacity. I want to know
what's going on under the surface.
We have a great capacity for compartmentalization. And when we are confronted with a security threat, we make the immediate switch. And Israelis have that remarkable capacity from one moment to the next to become a mobilized society. But we also have the reverse capacity, which is a source of our mental health. We're able to demobilize in an instant. We're able to. I was amazed when the Second Intifada ended. It simply ended. Israelis just went on as if we hadn't just spent 4 hellish years worrying every moment about the safety of our kids. Suddenly, it's over. Well, okay, it's over. Until ad ha'oda'ah ha'ba'ah, as we say in Hebrew, until the next notice. But we manage. We have this great capacity to maintain the pretense of normal life in the intervals, in the breathing spaces between national emergencies. And honestly, I'm living in Israel over 30 years. I don't know how Israelis do it.
But you do it somehow.
Yes, we do it. And I don't know how. I mean, I do it because everyone else around me is doing it. It's not my natural...
That helps, though.
It does. I think it does. It's not... My natural tendency is to be a warrior. I'm a deep warrior.
Really?
And yet, you realize that you just have to let go.
What's the message? The overarching message. And a person writes a book, there doesn't have to be an overarching message.
But in this case,
But
there is.
in this case, there is, isn't there?
Yes, there is.
Okay, what's the overarching reason you wrote the book and the message that you hope American Jews and anybody who reads this book, wherever they are in the world, and has it yet been translated to every single language? Because if it hasn't, it will be.
Noch nicht. Not yet.
Ultimately, you want people to read this book for a reason. Yossi, try to explain why.
The best way that I can try to answer that question is by saying something about how it was written, the style of the book. It's 7 characters, 7 main characters. Some are to the left, some are to the right. And the book goes in and out of their lives. And when you are reading about a settler, the book is right-wing. The book takes you into his being, his soul. And the perspective of the book is entirely uncritically right-wing. When you read about a left-winger, the perspective abruptly changes and you are now in a left-wing state of mind. And it goes back and forth. The characters keep shifting. You experience the same events. You experience the Yom Kippur War or Sadat's visit through a left-wing consciousness and a right-wing consciousness. And the purpose of that was to disorient the reader. So that whatever your politics are, and I don't care, as long as you love Israel, I don't care if you lean left, if you lean right, if I want you to enter into the state of mind of these men who gave us reunited Jerusalem and then went on to fight another 3 or 4 wars. These men who gave us Israel. I want you, if you lean left, I want you to have the settlers in your mind as real live people, not as caricatures. And if you lean right, I want you to have the Peace Now activists, the kibbutzniks in your mind. Because what the message of this book for me is that there is no left-wing narrative about Israel or a right-wing narrative. There is an Israeli narrative. And these men who fought together, who come out of the same metaphorical or in some cases literal tent, who shared a tent in the defense of Israel, and then reached opposite conclusions about how to keep Israel safe, I want American Jews to enter, to experience something of that shared tent. And one of the extraordinary experiences that I had in writing this book was realizing just how entwined these stories are. They were friends. The most bitter political rivals would get together every year in reserve duty and vehemently argue with each other and defend each other, physically defend each other. And this is what I find so extraordinary about the Israeli story, which so many American Jews don't understand because American Jews don't have that shared tent experience. And it's the intimacy of the Israeli story that I wanted to tell here. For me, the message of this book is the fact that all these characters are part of the same story. That Hanan Porat, who founded the settlement movement, and Meir Ariel, who is the troubadour of the kibbutz and the peace movement, they come out of the same moment, the same shared traumas and triumphs. That's what the story is about to me. And when I discovered, and I didn't know that when I started writing, I knew it in principle, but to know that leaders of the settlement movement and the peace movement were part of the same unit, and what a unit, what a unit, what a story. So the message of the book is the book itself.
You're helping us embrace the entirety of Israel, aren't you?
Klal Yisrael.
Yes.
If you're asking me what my politics are, somebody asked me the other day, I did an event in Westchester with the Jewish Week, and someone asked me there, how do you define yourself religiously? And I didn't know what to say at first, and finally I said, I'm a Klal Yisrael Jew. That's how I grew up. My father, who was a Holocaust survivor, was a Klal Yisrael Jew. I grew up in the Soviet Jewry movement. That was a Klal Yisrael movement. What the tragedy of the Jewish people today is that we are confusing the noun, which is Jew, for the adjectives. Orthodox, Reform, left, right, those are the adjectives. And we are centralizing the adjectives and displacing the noun. And that is also one of the messages of this book.
By the way, there could be no more important message, and I say this also with humility myself. I love that about you. It is who you are. Anybody who has been in your presence for a minute and a half understands that. It is really the message you model for us what we really want Jewish life to be. It's not about movements. It's not about left and right. You know, Ele ve'ele, Divrei Elohim Chayim.
That's our being.
Both sides are speaking for this living God. And you're able to show that in this book, and then you live it. And I hope you understand, again, I say this with humility. It's what drives Shalom TV. Shalom TV is not an Orthodox, it's not a Reform, it's not a conservative, it's not a right wing, it's not a left wing.
Well,
I like your phrase, though. Somebody says to me, what kind of Jew are you? I say, I'm like, eclectic. I like your answer better. I'm a Klal Yisrael Jew. There's a Klal Yisrael attempt to really expose the world and embrace the world with Jewish life. You have done this. You have done this magnificently in this book. And it's also something you've done your whole career. You know,
and Mark, you have as well. And God bless what you're doing here.
Thank
really,
you.
God be with
Thank
you, because this is what we need. This is exactly the kind of media that the Jewish people needs today.
Thank you, Yossi, very much. I will only let you go, though, if you promise you'll come back and sit there again.
That'll be a great pleasure.
Okay.
Thank you. Toda rabah.
Yossi Klein Halevi, Like Dreamers, the story of the Israeli paratroopers who reunited Jerusalem and divided a nation, published by HarperCollins. You will do yourself such a favor. But again, there are books which come out periodically, and they become instant classics, and then they'll be referred to and looked to for insight and wisdom for generations. This is one of them. Either it'll be a part of your Jewish library today or tomorrow, if there's a Jewish holiday fast approaching. This is a fabulous gift for yourself and for anybody you love. Yossi Klein Halevi's Like Dreamers. We didn't talk about the fact that where this title comes from. You should just tell us very quickly.
Psalm 126.
Psalm 126.
When the Lord returned the exiles to Zion, we were like dreamers.
Like dreamers. It makes me cry. Just Mazal Tov. Yasher Koach.
Thank you so much.
As always, I invite you to be in touch with us with any thoughts or comments you may have to anything Yossi said on this edition of L'Chaim, and you know how much I love to hear from you. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, tweet me. I look forward to hearing from you. And as always, if you'd like to be in touch yourself with Yossi Klein Halevi, you email me, I will forward your emails on to him. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'Chaim, my friends, to life.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.
L'Chaim is a presentation of Jewish Education in Media.